How's it going, guys? It's Boo from Hi Distilling. Today we're actually continuing on our Distilling 101 series. In our last video we covered fermentation, and now we're going to be covering actual distilling in this series. We're going to be talking about Distilling 101, literally, like what even is distilling? How do you distill? What happens in that process? So we'll continue along that path. We're then going to be giving you some tips and tricks to get you started on the right path as a beginner distiller. We'll be talking about different types of stills and their processes. We're going to be talking about equipment. Outside of the still, we also have heaters we have to worry about, different things that we're going to need to get started in the craft the right way. And then we're also going to have a lot of resources to talk about. There is a ton of resources out there, some free like our YouTube videos and different articles we offer, different forums pages you can join up in. All the way to paid books, paid classes. You can fly down and sort of just get a distilling class and learn how to do it that way as well. So lots of those to talk about. I think we'll just get right into it, folks. Welcome to Distilling 101 Distillation. Let's start by covering distilling basics. Namely, we'll start off with how does distilling work. So what we have here is your regular run-of-the-mill boiler. This is going to be filled with liquid, and we'll have some sort of heat source on this system. It could be a propane stove or a hot plate below, could be an electrical heating element in the side of the still. One way or the other, that liquid is going to be boiled. Now, as it boils, what happens when you boil water on the stove? It starts to vaporize, right? It starts to turn into vapor. So vapors are going to push up, and see how this goes out and then starts to taper in. Well, that's not a necessity, but this is going to help concentrate the vapor flow and have it go where we want it to go, namely on top of a tower. Now at the top of this can, you should have a tower, something like that, to actually push the vapor through. So vapor will continue to push through. Let's ignore this chamber for the time being, ignore the reflux. Vapor is going to continue to push up, and it's going to go the path of least resistance. It's going to have this small hole. So it's going to be kind of sucking through there in a very easy way to say it. And as those vapors come through, they're going to make contact with this very cold chamber. And in that process, we're now taking this hot vapor, colliding it with this cold liquid, and in turn, we are essentially weighing down that vapor, condensing it back to a liquid, and it's coming out the other end. Now in that process of taking the liquid, heating it up, and condensing it back into a liquid, that's refining everything in that initial liquid composition. So we can take water here, and the process of distilling is actually removing a lot of those impurities. They're being left behind. They're not going to travel with the vapor. And then when they come down to recondense, now you have cleaner water. The same is going to go for alcohol, and that's why we see higher alcohol strengths when run through a still. We can take a 15% alcoholic solution and put it in this boiler. That means whatever's in this boiler is only 15% of that is alcohol. But as we're boiling it, it's going to concentrate the ethanol. It's going to hit the boiling point of just the ethanol. It's going to vaporize it, and then in that process of recondensing, it's bonding it in a way. It's strengthening that compound. So we're able to take a 15% solution and turn it into 160 proof or 80% solution through the process of distilling. Now back to this chamber. Again, we'll talk about this in a later point in the video. This chamber is known as a reflux condenser, and this is acting the same as this final product condenser is. Your liquid in your boiler will boil through all the way up the kettle. It's going to go through your column, and then it's going to make contact with this cold chamber. As we just discussed, hot vapor, cold liquid in the chamber, that's going to condense our spirit. And so that vapor is going to become too heavy and forces itself to drop back down. Now it goes back into the boiler, and when it's back in the boiler, it's heated up, so it's going to reboil again. So in that process, we're refining it already. It's going to go up through the boiler, through the tower, down, all the way back down to the boiler, back up through the boiler, through the tower, and this time it's light enough to pass through this chamber. It's refined enough, it's clean enough, I guess we'll say. and so it'll continue along its process. And then here we have our final product condenser, and the gravity of this pushing down and everything else is going to force that back into a liquid. So it's basically like a double refined spirit through a reflux. So now that we know how distillation is essentially working, we have to ask ourselves, what can we do with the still? As far as that goes, we have quite the list. Any sort of alcoholic composition can be run through the still. So we're not talking just, you can make a fermentation out of maybe fruits for a brandy or out of grains for a whiskey, but we're also talking about bad batches of beer will be refined and cleaned up through a still, bad batches of wine or meat. We're also talking about water. Water can be thrown through a still, and the same way it's doing with alcohol, it'll do with water. It'll go ahead and clean that water up, remove a lot of the impurities in it, clean drinking water. Now on top of that, we can install special components into our still, and those stills can be used for essential oil distillation. So you can take plant material, boil that plant material with that water, it'll go through, it'll extract what it needs to extract, and then come out the other end, and then you'll have something to separate out the hydrosols from the actual oil at the end. Now we can get even crazier than that with the still. We can make soaps with these stills, we can make laundry detergent, we can make fuel. We can do a lot of different things with a still. I always say, if the zombie apocalypse ever hits, I'm just going to come straight to work. I've got everything I need with the still. So stills are really a wonderful tool to have for a lot of different reasons. Now more to that, let's also talk about spirit types with a still. As far as spirit types go, you've probably seen at a liquor store the incredible list of spirits you can get. We know our common ones. We can get our brandies, our whiskeys, our vodkas out of a still, depending on what base we use, what base we fermented with. But we can even make some less common spirits. We can make chartreuse, we can make malort, we can make waragi. All that's going to be possible with a still. And in fact, those spirits were created through a still to begin with. Let's also take a second here and talk in our basics of distilling about a sore subject: legality of distilling. I am by no means a lawyer, nor am I some sort of police enforcement agency, so I can't tell you exactly how it is, but in my experience at this place, nearly a decade of experience, I've heard a lot, I've seen a lot, and here's kind of my rundown of things. The reality is, in my opinion, distilling is sort of a gray area. I say that because, the laws are pretty cut and dry. You cannot legally distill from your home. There are certain laws coming out. West Virginia just passed one. At the end of the day, if you read the fine print, you cannot legally distill. Now, there are state laws that say otherwise. Like I just mentioned, West Virginia, Missouri, I believe has one as well. But you have to remember, federal law trumps state law. So that means probably no one in West Virginia, no lawman's going to come breaking down your door for owning a still, I take it. But if things got too heated, you ended up selling too much to your town, whatever it is, you might be visited by an FBI agent, really in this instance, it'd probably be DEA. Keep that in mind, but also, I don't want to scare anyone because, again, I've had a lot of experience with this, and I can tell you, I've had chief of police in Colorado, multiple, buy stills from us. I've had lawyers buy stills. I've had FBI agents buy stills right here. I think a lot of these laws are going to be Prohibition-era laws that really don't have too much of an effect on modern-day distilling. What is legal is you can legally own a still. You are completely and utterly able to own a piece of equipment from us. We don't have to put you on a list. We don't report to anyone here. I don't think we ever will have to. None of that has to be done. And even if it was, there's nothing legally wrong with owning a still. As far as what you can do with that still, again, somewhat of a gray area, but my understanding is that you're legally allowed to distill water out of this unit, and you're also legally allowed to make oils out of this unit. When we sell stills, what they are water distillers. We don't require a permit to own our stills. We don't require an ID. We don't ask what you're doing with the still because it's really none of our business. As far as we know, all you're using this for is legal purposes such as water, and if you choose to do otherwise, well, I guess that would just be your call. And I think for the most part, the TTB has come to understand that. I would say about 10 years ago now, there was a pretty big sting with the TTB. They were going around to every single distillery equipment facility like us, like all the suppliers that you've seen online and otherwise, and asking for records to be turned over. Now that continued for probably 2 years or so, I think 3. And then basically they pretty much flat out told us that they do not have the time, the resources, the money to go after all these people. They had no clue how big distilling was in this age, and they physically could not keep track of it all. So records stopped, and I think the TTB realized that this was a losing battle. With that said, I think where you can start getting into trouble with home distilling is if you're stepping on the government's toes and taking away from their money. Government loves their money. If you're going crazy and selling all over your town or city, then that's when you can start to maybe get in trouble. I've heard of one story in 10 years, and the guy was running I think a 53-gallon still in his garage, and basically sold his whole town his supply. So I think he did end up getting fined. This usually doesn't follow jail time as far as I've seen, but there'll probably be some fines involved. So again, keep it down, make it for you and maybe your neighbors, and maybe give some out as gifts, and keep it at that. I look at it kind of like marijuana. In most cases, here in the US and Canada, cops not gonna bust you for a quarter ounce of weed in your pocket. What they might do is if you're selling pounds of it to your entire neighborhood, then yeah, they probably got you on a bigger charge, and they'll probably go after you. So I think the same rules apply. We're making these videos. There's plenty of other YouTubers that are distilling on camera, and you don't see anything happen to them. So really, that's kind of my take on things. I don't think distilling is as big as an issue as it was back in Prohibition era days. And I think for the most part, we can get away with a lot, okay? As long as we keep our wits about us and try to be respectful. Now, I also want to give you guys some tips and tricks. If you're a beginner distiller, hopefully some of these tips will come in handy for you. If you're a novice distiller, you know what you're doing. You know, maybe we can rehash and let me know if I missed anything. But a few things that I'd like to bring up to those beginning is a big part of distilling is going to be your cuts. So pay attention to those cuts, do research on your cuts. We have a few good videos on making cuts, as well as other YouTubers do as well. There's plenty of forums postings out there, different things like that where you can learn more about cuts. And again, you have to be kind of careful in this industry. Everyone has different ways of doing things, and everyone kind of spouts things off as facts, even though they might not be. I try not to do it, but I'm a little bit guilty of it as well. People bicker all the time on cuts in general. I'd recommend watching our video on cuts so you can kind of understand ratios of cuts a little bit better. Do your research, and at the end of the day, when it comes to cuts, remember, use your smell and taste. That's really a really good indicator of where a lot of our cuts are. We're going to be able to identify that methanol, that nail polish remover smell pretty easily with our noses and even sipping it. We're going to be able to tell when our flavor starts to kind of change when we go from hearts into tails. We're able to do that with just our natural senses. So to me, forget about ratios, forget about percentages of cuts, forget about all that. For the most part, have them in there as landmarks, but really trust your nose and all your senses. Like I said, there's a lot of other YouTubers out there. Go ahead and just type in making cuts, distilling on YouTube, Google, whatever you need. Kind of read around a few things and form your own opinions. There are some rumors with cuts. People say it makes you go blind. People say that, you know, it can poison you. The reality is no, it cannot. Methanol itself can, but in distilling, we are not refined enough. We don't isolate the methanol in a still. When we pump methanol out of a still, it's not pure methanol coming out of there. It's a mix of ethanol, congeners, so many different things in that composition. And so, even though 30 milliliters of pure methanol is enough to blind you, in distilling, you just won't see it. It just won't happen. There's just not enough of a concentration of that methanol to do it. So keep that in mind if you're beginning. Don't get too discouraged with that. A lot of people stay away from distilling because they hear it'll make you go blind, and I can tell you 100% confident in the fact that that is a myth. But anyways, yeah, when you're starting out, cuts are going to be a pretty important thing to really research. Another thing that's really going to be helpful to a lot of newbie distillers is getting a good heat source. Out of most of the people I talk to here that are having a problem with their stills, it has to do with some sort of heat problem. Whether they're using too much cold water to cool their still, maybe they're pumping their heat too fast. There's a variety of different issues that can happen. A lot of them can be linked to just heat regulation. So I'd recommend, as a beginner distiller or otherwise, honestly, if you've been running before, consider what your heat source is and seeing if you want to upgrade. Propane stoves and hot plates are pretty common heat sources. You'll see on them, and again, I'm not trying to knock them. People get them to work, but the regulation can be increased. See this hot plate here? As far as dialing go, I mean, we've got a low, we've got a medium, we've got a high, and we've got an off. That's pretty much all we have for control on that side. And propane, you're going to get a little more control with that flame, but it's so powerful that sometimes it's really hard to regulate, especially on lower size stills, smaller size stills. So what you can look at is something like this. This is an electrical control box. We're going to see here, it's got a dial, minimum to maximum. And you have, every time you adjust with this, you're moving up basically 0.1 amp. So you get really high precision control, and you can dial in by the amp. So just in my experience as a distiller, I've been spoiled by these controllers. It's what I've used most of my time as a distiller, and it just simplifies everything. I started on a still that used a hot plate, and going to this electrical controller, I mean, I really wish I would have had that at the very beginning, because that's when you really need to understand heat and you need the most control possible, is when you're first beginning. It just simplifies everything. It helps with your speed. It helps calm you down when things get too hot, or too cold in your still. So something I really wish I knew as a beginner was your heat source is a huge part as you begin to pick out your equipment. Another tip I have for you guys is start easy with your fermentation. As far as stills go, yeah, you can start easy there too. You can get like a really basic still, but we have to think also of how far we're going to move in with this craft. For example, you can start with a little Vivor pot still on Amazon and go cheap on it, but we have to think, are you ever going to be interested in trying different spirits that Vivor can accomplish? As far as gins and vodkas go, I mean, you wouldn't really be able to do that with Vivors that I've seen. So if that's an interest of yours, you need to consider that. Consider getting a dual purpose still, something that can do both pot still mode for more flavor and reflux mode for higher purity. You need to think also whether those stills are modular or not. You want a still that you can kind of grow into if you need. So something that's jointed and that you can basically put parts into or take parts out of to change the process is a very good thing to think of when you're first looking at getting a still. So I wouldn't say start easy so much as in the still you get. I'd consider getting a nice machine that's going to keep you going for years and years to come and you continue to grow with. How I meant start easy was, again, not in the still itself, but mainly just what you work with. A lot of people want to do it the traditional way, get a still and start cooking up some corn and get going on a batch. Really, corn is, in my personal opinion, one of the harder fermentations and bases you can make. Corn is starchy. You have to convert those starches to sugars. If you don't know what you're doing, you can easily get little to no alcohol content. It's going to be messy and sticky. And I think for some people, they might do that to start with and say this isn't worth the hassle to make this much liquor. Start small. Let's start easy. Start with something that's easily fermentable with a high yield and low maintenance. So sugar is really my favorite base to recommend to beginners. You take sugar, water, and yeast. You ferment that and you create a shine or a vodka or a neutral spirit, whatever you want to call it. And then from there you can play around with flavoring that, different things like that. But that base is really easy and it's going to help you understand how to work your still. I'd recommend giving your still a few runs through just something easy to kind of learn how the machine works. Same could even go for rum. If you don't really want that vodka, you can just replace that sugar with brown sugar or molasses and just one simple ingredient. So molasses, water, and yeast, and then you have a rum. Same goes for tequila. You can do agave, syrup, water, and yeast, and your tequila base will begin to ferment. So start with one of those spirits that are a little bit easier, and then start working your ways up with grains and fruits that have different problems. A lot of those grains you have to convert starches with and use enzymes and pH testing strips and different equipment that might be a little bit hard at the beginning to kind of get it all. One other thing I'd really recommend to you guys is pay attention to the ingredients you're using, because that is a big part of what you make. The way I see it, maybe 1% is going to be the material of your still, what it does for you. I would say 9% is going to be your recipe, and 90% of creating a good spirit is on you as a distiller, what you do, your process, your operations. But that 9% definitely goes to your ingredients, I think. So what I mean is, for a sugar wash, if that's how you start, I used to go to just King Soopers, pick up a bunch of table sugar, distill that, and sure, that works fine. But then I got my hand on some raw cane sugar, brown sugar, things that are less refined. There's less of a process to making them. And wow, I can tell you, in those two types of sugar, there is a noticeable difference in the way my spirit comes out. So try to use high quality ingredients, and try to be careful of your process. Labor of love. For example, with fruit, usually my fruit is done in 2 weeks fermenting, but I'll let it sit an additional 1 to 2 weeks and just let it sit in there and macerate. With grains, it might take a little bit, but make sure you have a good recipe going. Don't just throw in a bunch of random grains. I've tried that before. It doesn't always work. Sometimes it does, but very rarely. So try to do some research, look at your base, look at what you're putting in, get high quality grains, and really, if you get the right ingredients, once you know what you're doing as a distiller, you can make some top shelf stuff. The stuff you see at the liquor store for $60, $80, you can make that at your home. Now guys, we're still gonna have a lot of stuff to cover in Distilling 101. We're gonna push it to the next video. We're gonna try to keep this under 20 minutes here. I wanna thank you so much for watching part 1. If you enjoyed the video, please be sure to like and subscribe. I hope you learned a thing or two. Get ready for part 2, where we're going to be talking about different types of stills. We'll be talking about equipment and things you need outside of the still itself, plus the still itself. And then we're going to go into some resources and help you get set on the right track to becoming a great distiller. Thank you guys. Appreciate you watching.